What happens after 15 years of marriage when you discover your 5 kids aren't yours? The sun rose over the quiet streets of Bolivia, casting a soft golden light over the modest Caldwell home. Herman Caldwell sat at the kitchen table, sipping his morning coffee while watching his wife, Geneva, prepare breakfast for their 5 children. It was a scene that could have been plucked from a family movie. The smell of scrambled eggs wafting through the air, the sound of children's laughter echoing in the background, and Geneva's warm smile as she hummed along to the radio. To anyone watching, it would have seemed like the Caldwells had the perfect life. But perfection is often an illusion. Herman and Geneva had been married for 15 years. They'd met in 1991 at a local festival when Herman was 28 and Geneva was 22. At the time, Herman worked as a mechanic, and Geneva had just started her job as a receptionist at a real estate office. Their connection had been instant, or so Herman thought. Within a year, they were married, and their first child, a boy named Marcus, was born in 1993. Over the years, 4 more children followed: Emily in 1995, twins Noah and Natalie in 1998, and the youngest, Sarah, in 2002. Herman prided himself on being a devoted husband and father. He worked long hours at his garage to provide for his family, while Geneva managed the household and cared for the children. He thought they made a great team. Geneva was the love of his life, his rock. But in 2007, something began to change. It started subtly. Geneva became distant, distracted. She no longer greeted Herman with her usual warmth when he came home from work. At night, she often stayed up late, claiming she was too busy with household tasks to go to bed. Herman noticed she was spending more time on her phone, smiling at messages she refused to share. When he asked her about it, she brushed him off, saying it was just her friends from her weekly book club. But Herman couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. By mid-January 2007, Herman's suspicions had deepened. Geneva had started leaving the house more frequently, often with vague explanations about errands or meeting friends. Once she returned home late, disheveled and smelling faintly of cologne that didn't belong to Herman. When he questioned her, Geneva laughed it off and called him paranoid. "You're imagining things, Herman," she said. "You need to trust me." But trust was becoming harder for Herman to give. He started paying closer attention to Geneva's behavior, and the more he watched, the less he liked what he saw. One evening, he overheard her whispering on the phone in the laundry room. The conversation was brief, and when Herman asked who she was talking to, Geneva claimed it was her sister. He knew she was lying. Her sister lived in another country and rarely called. That night, as Herman lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he felt a knot of unease growing in his stomach. Something was wrong, and he was determined to find out what. The tipping point came in early February 2007. Herman was in the garage fixing a customer's car when his eldest son, Marcus, stopped by to bring him lunch. At 14 years old, Marcus was the spitting image of Geneva: dark hair, hazel eyes, and a charming smile. But as Herman looked at his son that day, something struck him. Marcus didn't resemble Herman at all. In fact, none of the children did. It was a thought that had crossed his mind before, but he'd always dismissed it. Now, with Geneva's behavior raising so many red flags, the thought refused to go away. That evening, after the children had gone to bed, Herman sat alone at the kitchen table, turning the idea over in his mind. Was it possible that Marcus wasn't his biological son? The mere suggestion felt like a betrayal, but the more he thought about it, the more he felt compelled to know the truth. He decided to take matters into his own hands. The next morning, while everyone was still asleep, Herman took a cotton swab and gently collected a DNA sample from Marcus's toothbrush. He'd read about at-home DNA testing kits online and ordered one to be delivered to his workplace. It felt wrong, like a violation of trust, but Herman convinced himself it was necessary. He needed answers. The days that followed were some of the longest of Herman's life. He went about his routine as usual, but his mind was consumed by the pending DNA results. Geneva's behavior only added to his unease. She'd become even more secretive, often avoiding eye contact and snapping at Herman over minor issues. He wanted to confront her, to demand the truth, but he held back. He needed proof. Finally, on February 20th, 2007, The results arrived. Herman waited until he was alone in the garage before opening the envelope. His hands trembled as he unfolded the paper and read the words that would shatter his world. Probability of paternity, 0%. Herman stared at the paper in disbelief. His heart pounded in his chest and his vision blurred. It didn't make sense. Marcus was his son, he had to be. But the DNA test didn't lie. Herman felt a wave of nausea wash over him as the reality began to sink in. If Marcus wasn't his biological child, what did that mean for the rest of his children? He couldn't stop now. He had to know the truth no matter how much it hurt. The days following the DNA results for Marcus were a haze for Herman Caldwell. The truth weighed on him like a boulder crushing his chest. He couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Every time he looked at Marcus or any of his children, he felt a profound sense of betrayal. Were they all not his? The idea seemed impossible, cruel even. But the nagging suspicion wouldn't let him rest. He needed to know. He couldn't move forward without answers. On February 23, 2007, just 3 days after receiving Marcus's DNA results, Herman made the painful decision to test the rest of his children. He told himself it didn't mean he loved them any less. After all, he'd raised them. He'd been their father in every way that mattered. But the possibility that they might not be his biological children gnawed at him. He needed the truth, no matter how devastating it might be. Herman waited until the house was quiet that night. Geneva had gone to bed early, claiming a headache, and the children were all asleep in their rooms. With a heavy heart, Herman quietly crept through the house, gathering toothbrushes from each of the children's bathrooms. He felt like a thief in his own home, sneaking through the hallways and avoiding creaky floorboards. The guilt was overwhelming, but he pushed it aside. He had to see this through. By the next morning, Herman had sent off the samples to the same DNA testing lab he'd used for Marcus. The waiting began again, and this time it was even harder. Every interaction with his children felt like an act of deception. Emily, now 12, asked him one evening why he seemed so sad. Herman forced a smile and told her he was just tired from work, but inside he felt like he was falling apart. The tension in the house grew thicker by the day. Geneva noticed Herman's mood and asked him several times if something was wrong. "You've been so distant lately," she said one evening as they sat in the living room. "What's going on, Herman?" Herman wanted to confront her right then and there. He wanted to scream at her, demand answers, ask her how she could do this to him. But he held back. He needed to know for sure before he accused her of anything. "I'm fine," he muttered, avoiding her gaze. "Just stressed about work." By early March, the DNA results finally arrived. Herman waited until he was alone in the garage to open the envelope. His hands shook as he unfolded the papers and read the results for each child. Emily. Probability of paternity, 0%. Noah. Probability of paternity, 0%. Natalie. Probability of paternity, 0%. Sarah. Probability of paternity, 0%. Herman stared at the results, his mind unable to process what he was seeing. None of the children were biologically his, not one. He felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him, like he was free-falling into an abyss. For 15 years, he'd believed he was a father to these children. He'd loved them, cared for them, sacrificed for them. And now, it felt like his entire life had been a lie. He crumpled the papers in his fists and let out a guttural scream, the sound echoing through the empty garage. Tears streamed down his face as he sank to the floor, his entire body trembling. How could this be happening? How could Geneva do this to him? The woman he'd loved, trusted, built a life with. She'd betrayed him in the most profound way imaginable. For hours, Herman sat alone in the garage, staring at the crumpled papers. His mind raced with questions he didn't have answers to. Who was the father of his children? How long had Geneva been lying to him? Had their entire marriage been a sham? He felt an overwhelming mix of emotions: anger, sadness, confusion, and a deep, aching sense of loss. By the time he returned to the house that evening, Herman had made up his mind. He couldn't keep this to himself any longer. He needed to confront Geneva. He needed to hear the truth from her own lips. The confrontation came on the evening of March 10th, 2007. Herman had spent the entire day rehearsing what he would say, but when the moment came, the words tumbled out of him in a torrent of anger and pain. Geneva was in the kitchen preparing dinner when Herman stormed in and slammed the DNA results down on the counter. "What the hell is this, Geneva?" he demanded, his voice shaking with rage. Geneva froze, her eyes darting to the crumpled papers. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice laced with nervousness. Herman pointed to the papers. "I did DNA tests. On all the kids. None of them are mine. Not a single one, Geneva. How do you explain that?" Geneva's face went pale. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, tears welled up in her eyes, and she covered her face with her hands. "Don't you dare cry," Herman snapped, his voice rising. "You don't get to cry. You lied to me, Geneva. For 15 years, you lied to me. Who's the father, huh? Who have you been sleeping with?" For a moment, Geneva said nothing, her shoulders shaking as she sobbed. Finally, she looked up at Herman, her face streaked with tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." "Sorry?" Herman shouted. "That's all you have to say? Sorry. Who is he, Geneva? Tell me." Geneva hesitated, her lips trembling. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Nigel. His name is Nigel Cook." Herman felt like he'd been punched in the gut. The name was unfamiliar, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that Geneva had been unfaithful to him, not just once, but repeatedly. And not just with anyone, but with a man who fathered all 5 of their children. "How long?" Herman asked, his voice cold. "How long has this been going on?" Geneva looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "Since before we got married," she admitted. "It started before you and I. And it never stopped." Herman's world shattered in that moment. Everything he'd believed about his marriage, his family, his life, it had all been a lie. He felt a surge of anger so intense it scared him. He clenched his fists, his entire body trembling with fury. "You've been lying to me for 15 years, he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You let me believe I was their father. You let me build my life around this family, and all the while you were sneaking around with this Nigel." Geneva sobbed, trying to reach out to him. "Herman, please, I never meant to hurt you. I love you." "Don't!" Herman shouted, stepping back. "Don't you dare say you love me. You don't even know what love is." The argument continued for what felt like hours, the two of them shouting, crying, hurling accusations and apologies. By the end of it, Herman felt completely drained. Geneva fell to her knees, begging for his forgiveness, but Herman couldn't even look at her. He turned and walked out of the house, slamming the door behind him. That night, as Herman sat alone in the garage, the anger and betrayal consumed him. He couldn't see a way forward. The life he'd spent 15 years building was gone, destroyed by Geneva's lies. And the more he thought about it, the more the anger burned inside him. The night of March 10th, 2007, was one Herman Caldwell would never forget. After his explosive confrontation with Geneva, he sat alone in the garage, replaying her confession over and over in his mind. Her words echoed like a cruel taunt. Since before we got married, it never stopped. Every fiber of his being burned with betrayal, humiliation, and rage. The woman he had loved for 15 years, the mother of the children he had cherished, had been lying to him from the very beginning. He couldn't make sense of it. He didn't want to. Herman wasn't sure how long he sat there in the dim light of the garage. Hours, maybe. He stared at the crumpled DNA results on the workbench, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. Anger bubbled to the surface, raw and uncontrollable. Geneva's betrayal wasn't just about the affair. It was the years of deception, the way she had let him love and raise children that weren't his. It was the way she had stolen his life and replaced it with a lie. By the time Herman re-entered the house, it was past midnight. The house was silent, the children asleep in their rooms. Geneva was sitting at the dining room table, her face pale and tear-streaked. She looked up when Herman walked in, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and regret. "Herman," she began, her voice trembling. "I don't know what to say. I know I've hurt you, but please, we can get through this. We can—" Get through this? Herman interrupted, his voice cold and distant. You think there's anything left to get through, Geneva? You've destroyed everything. Geneva's lips quivered. I didn't mean for it to happen this way. I never meant to hurt you. I love you, Herman. I do. Herman let out a bitter laugh. Love? Don't talk to me about love. If you loved me, you wouldn't have done this. You wouldn't have lied to me for 15 years. You wouldn't have let me believe those kids were mine. They are yours, Geneva pleaded, standing up from her chair. Maybe not biologically, but you're their father. You're the one who raised them, cared for them. Don't, Herman shouted, his voice echoing through the room. His chest heaved with anger. Don't try to justify this, Geneva. Don't try to tell me that what you did was okay. Nothing about this is okay. Geneva stepped closer, reaching out to him. Please, Herman, you're a good man. You've always been a good man. Don't let this ruin everything we've built. But Herman was beyond reason. The storm of emotions inside him, anger, heartbreak, humiliation, was too much to contain. He felt like a volcano on the verge of eruption, and Geneva's pleas only fueled the fire. You don't get to talk about what we built, Herman said through gritted teeth. You destroyed it the moment you climbed into bed with another man, the moment you decided to let him father all of our children. Herman, please, who is he? Herman demanded, cutting her off. Who is Nigel Cook? Where is he? Does he even know about the kids? Geneva hesitated, and for a moment Herman thought she wouldn't answer. Then, in a quiet voice, she said, Yes, he knows. He's always known. Herman's blood boiled. Nigel Cook wasn't just some faceless stranger. He was a man who had knowingly intruded on Herman's life, who had stolen from him in ways Herman couldn't even put into words. The image of Nigel, whoever he was, filled Herman's mind, and the rage became overwhelming. Geneva must have seen the change in his expression because she took a step back. Herman, she said cautiously, you need to calm down. Please, But Herman couldn't calm down. The betrayal, the lies, the sheer audacity of it all. It was too much. Before he even realized what he was doing, his hands were around Geneva's throat. She gasped, her eyes wide with shock, and clawed at his arms, but Herman's grip was unrelenting. All of the anger and pain he'd been holding in for weeks, for years, exploded in that moment. I gave you everything, he shouted, his voice raw with emotion. I loved you, I trusted you, and you threw it all away for him. Geneva's struggles grew weaker, her hands falling limply to her sides. It wasn't until she stopped moving entirely that Herman seemed to snap out of his rage. He released her, stepping back in horror as her body crumpled to the floor. Her lifeless eyes stared up at him, and the reality of what he had done hit him like a freight train. No, he whispered, his voice trembling. No, no, no. Herman dropped to his knees beside her, shaking her shoulders as if he could wake her up. But it was too late. Geneva was gone. For several minutes, Herman sat there in stunned silence, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. He hadn't meant to kill her. He'd just lost control. But now she was dead, and there was no undoing it. Eventually, the sound of footsteps upstairs snapped Herman out of his daze. The children. They couldn't see this. They couldn't know what had happened. Panicking, Herman grabbed a blanket from the couch and draped it over Geneva's body. He needed to think. He needed to figure out what to do. But before he could make a decision, there was a knock at the door. Detective Kingsley Harris had seen his fair share of crime scenes in Bolivia, but there was something about the Caldwell case that unsettled him. When he arrived at the Caldwell home on the morning of March 11, 2007, he was greeted by the sight of Geneva Caldwell's body lying on the living room floor, her face pale and bruised. Herman Caldwell sat on the couch, his head in his hands, while uniformed officers questioned him. "What do we have here?" Harris asked one of the officers. "Domestic dispute gone wrong," the officer replied. Herman Caldwell confessed to killing his wife during an argument. Harris frowned, his sharp eyes scanning the room. Something about the scene didn't sit right with him. He'd spoken to the neighbors, who all described the Caldwells as a happy, loving family. Herman didn't have a history of violence, and by all accounts, he was a devoted husband and father. So what had driven him to murder? As Harris began his investigation, the pieces of the puzzle slowly came together. He found the crumpled DNA results in the garage, along with the testing kit receipts. He interviewed the Caldwell children, who were confused and frightened, but mentioned overhearing their parents arguing about Nigel. It didn't take long for Harris to uncover the truth about Geneva's affair. He tracked down Nigel Cook, who admitted to the relationship but claimed he hadn't seen Geneva in years. Nigel's confession corroborated Herman's story. The murder had been a crime of passion, fueled by years of betrayal and heartbreak. When Harris finally sat down with Herman, the man was a shell of his former self. He looked hollow, broken, as if the weight of his actions had drained the life out of him. "I didn't mean to kill her," Herman said, his voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't take it anymore. She lied to me, Detective. She lied to me for 15 years. Harris nodded, his expression grim. He'd seen how betrayal could push people to their breaking point, but that didn't excuse what Herman had done. In the end, Herman Caldwell was charged with second-degree murder. At his trial, his defense attorney argued that the crime was a result of temporary insanity, brought on by Geneva's years of deception. The jury was sympathetic but ultimately found him guilty. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison. As Harris closed the case file, he couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness for everyone involved. A family had been destroyed, lives ruined, all because of secrets and lies. It was a tragic reminder of how fragile the bonds of trust could be, and how devastating the consequences when those bonds were broken.
If this true crime story left you shocked and wanting more, don't forget to hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think really led to the tragic end? Was it love, jealousy, or something more sinister? Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next gripping tale. Your support helps us bring more stories that keep you on the edge of your seat.